Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians from the southern section of the front line to the northern section of the front line, the majority of which are in the Donetsk region. The Russians have managed to advance across the border area between the Kursk and the Sumy regions as they continue expanding their offensive operations in the Sumy regions further eastwards, as the Ukrainians are counterattacking in the western parts of the Russian Sumy incursion. The Russians in turn managed to advance in the western bank of the Serbis river line and the western parts of Chasiv Yar, leaving just a single square kilometer remaining under Ukrainian control of the 18 square kilometers that encompasses the city. The Russians also managed to advance here in the Donetsk direction and in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians continued advances in the Dacha area and gaining full control over Kamyanske in the Zaporizhzhia region. Starting out in the south, the Russians continued their offensive operations in the direction of Kamyanske, gaining full control over the town and continuing their advances within the Dacha area. With this advance, the Russians have full control over the town and are now developing offensive operations towards the fortified positions north of the town as they continue offensive operations along the Dacha area as well in the direction of Plevny. The objective of the Russians is likely to gain control over the southern bank of this river line ahead of the defensive line of the Ukrainians, gain control over the western flank, which will strengthen the offensive operations of the Russians here in the northern flank of Stepove, Sherbaki, and Sherbaki. Covering the northern flank will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations further east in the direction of Novandrivka and onwards towards Orehiv in the future. The Russian objective is to gain control over the high-rise buildings around the school area here south of the river line. This acts as a heavily fortified outpost of the Ukrainian armed forces, with the fortified positions and the town of Zaporizhzhia in the northern flank with the river line. The Ukrainians have a very solid position with the school area, including the high-rise apartment complexes. The Russian objective is likely to push along the Dacha area and gain control over the fortified positions. The fortified positions encompassing the southern flank of the apartment complex area and the Dacha area, providing cover for infantry to advance alongside the buildings and the urban areas towards the river line and then onwards towards the school and apartment complex area. This will allow the Russians to flank the school area from the west and from the south. At the same time, the Russians could develop offensive operations further eastwards along the forest lines on the eastern flank of it as well. This will allow the Russians to have a much better position ahead of storming this heavily fortified position. The Russians will likely heavily shell this both with FAB bombs and artillery ahead of storming it as well. The Ukrainian fortifications and defensive positions are heavily concentrated along the school area, as there are no other geographical advantageous areas south of the river line. Instead, the fortified positions are centered around the northern bank of the river line, where the high ground is situated around. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians also continue their offensive operations, advancing in three separate directions, both in the direction of Mirina in the center, where the Russians are storming the town from the northern flank, and in the eastern parts, where the Russians continue offensive operations, gain control over the eastern parts of the town, pushing the Ukrainians back to the central parts and southern parts of the town, putting them at the outskirts of the settlement, with the Russians on the southern and northern flanks, threatening their supply line and operationally encircling the remaining Ukrainian forces within the town. This will allow the Russians to gain full control over the town with little Ukrainian resistance, as they'll be forced to withdraw under fire by Russian forces, or to sit in the buildings with little to no supplies while being constantly struck by Russian artillery and FPV drones. The Russian forces have already entrenched themselves within Mirina, which will reduce their casualties by Ukrainian FPV drone fire. At the same time, the Russians continue offensive operations on the southern and eastern flank of Sqkm, storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and the settlement itself from the northeastern flank. This is at the same time as they are storming Mirina. Their objective is to gain control over the both settlements, the fortified positions in the area, to enter into the Dnipropetrovsk region and to prevent the Ukrainians from reorganizing themselves following the Russian breakthrough, following the capture of Shevchenko in the direction of Voskresenka, reaching the southern outskirts of the town. This allowed the Russians to cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian fortified positions to the east, and now gain control over both the defensive lines and the fortified positions in the southern flank of Mirina. On the northern flank of Tolstoy, the Russians managed to gain control over additional forest lines and fortified positions, while at the same time they managed to gain a foothold within Novokhatsk. We see with this located footage the Russian presence within the town, where they managed to gain control over the western parts, entrenching themselves within that part of the town. This cuts off the town from the remaining parts of the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, while the eastern parts of the town and Zaporizhzhia is now isolated from the rest. The Russian forces are here looking to gain control over both of these towns through this operational encirclement and then push onwards towards Zelenyi and Anderivka Klevtsove. We see that the Russians continue offensive operations at a high pace here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region in their attempts to prevent the Ukrainian forces from reorganizing and establishing themselves in the new defensive positions further west. Gaining control over the entire southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region will enable the Russian forces to launch offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region from additional angles, both to the southwest of Novopavlivka in the direction of Pokrovsk from the northeast and southeast, bypassing the Ukrainian defensive lines in the Zaporizhzhia region, as well as in the western flank of Pokrovsk further north in the direction of Novopavlivka, Meshova, and Slovianka. On the eastern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians continued offensive operations in the western flank of Donetsk towards the operational encircled Ukrainian positions. The Russians are here storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians on the high ground west of Novospassky and Chervenivka as they storm the towns of Katerinivka and Klebenbyk. Gaining control over the high ground here on the western flank of these towns will allow the Russians to have direct fire control on both the western and eastern flanks. This will speed up the Russian capture of the settlements here in the operational encirclement that was created by the Russians, and it will allow the Russians to push the positions up all the way to the reservoir on the southern flank of Kamyanske. Closing this pocket will allow the Russians to strengthen the offensive operations direction of the Shivka, Ivanopilya, Vilaora, and Pereshina here in the eastern and southern flanks of Kamyanske. It will also allow them to redirect forces direction of Yablonivka, strengthening their offensive operations on the western flank of Kamyanske. Speaking of the operational encirclement of Kamyanske, the city of Chasiv Yar is almost completely under Russian control. The remaining parts of the city is the southwestern outskirts of it, which the Russians are currently storming. The Ukrainians have a few fortified positions and residential buildings remaining under their control, the majority of which are on the very outskirts of the city, as a single square kilometer, just this part right here, remains under Ukrainian control, while the remaining 17 square kilometers are now under Russian control. With this, the Russians are very close to complete capture of Chasiv Yar. There's a grouping of Ukrainian forces operationally circled in the forest area in the central parts of the city, following which the Ukrainians would have no presence within the entirety of the city, which will allow the Russians to expand their offensive operations on the western, northern, and southern flanks of the city. With the high ground and the city itself under their control, the Russian offensive operations will significantly strengthen as they go further towards Kamyanske, especially on the northern flank, where the Russians will look to gain control over several settlements and fortified positions overlooking the highway that supplies Kamyanske from the northwest. To the south of Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians want to prevent the Russians from connecting their positions in the Donetsk direction with the ones in the Chasiv Yar direction, to which they are concentrating forces in the direction of Bilahora to counterattack the Russian forces storming the town from the south and from the east. However, the Russians are constantly recording the entryway into Bilahora, where they are covering the entire area. This allows them to detect the Ukrainian vehicles, and with this image here with shield-gate footage, we see several vehicles that were destroyed driving into Bilahora and within the town itself, as the Russians are looking to prevent the Ukrainians from gathering enough forces to launch a counterattack, while strengthening their own offensive operations both to the south and to the east of the town to gain full control of it, allowing them to cover the southern flank of the fortified positions along the canal, with control of the northern and southern flanks, will be able to connect the two sides with the wide enough buffer zone for the forces to connect between the northern and southern parts across the canal, with several additional crossings under their control. The Russians can gather a large force on the western bank of the canal and connect their forces from Donetsk with the ones in Chasiv Yar between the two cities, strengthening the cooperation between the northern and southern flanks of the battle over Kamyanske, as the Russians will continue to strengthen defensive operations and their supply lines for a operational encirclement over Kamyanske by gaining control over the positions to the south, east, and north of the city. Further north in the direction of the Zaporizhzhia river line, the Russians continue offensive operations, gaining control over additional positions here on the southern flank of Zelena Dolina. The Russians continue offensive operations along the main road towards the rear of Zaporizhzhia, gaining control over the town of Zaporizhzhia, will strengthen offensive operations of the Russians towards Liman itself directly head on. We see that the Russian forces, with control over Nova and securing the southern flank, now have additional opportunities to push further south towards Liman directly and towards the supply lines on the western flank of the town. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians continue to attempt to cut off the Russian positions in Nova by pushing in the direction of Rydkodup. However, so far they are unable to push the Russians out of the town, and heavy fighting is taking place not just within the town, but also along the river line, where the Russians are working on cutting off the main supply line and the engagement route of the Ukrainian forces, while heavily bombarding any Ukrainian positions on the eastern bank of the river line. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians continue offensive operations along the border area, where they're creating additional crossings from the Kursk region into the Sumy region. With this recent push, they pushed from Canal in the Kursk region to the town of Myropilya in the Sumy region, where they managed to gain a foothold in the northern outskirts of the town. This is the first foothold by the Russian forces since their attempt to gain control of Alexandria, which ended up in a communication failure between their assault groups and their entrenchment forces. With this push towards Myropilya, the Russians are looking to cut off the connection with Ukrainian forces here on the border area, which will strengthen our Russian abilities and capabilities to push across the border area into the Sumy region from the southern and northern flanks, while also entering into Alexandria, gaining control over it and pushing further towards Myropilya. The Sel River disconnects Myropilya from the remaining settlements here in the Sumy region, which will allow the Russians to establish themselves within Myropilya following the capture of the town and continue offensive operations into the Sumy region. The Russians would have a geographical advantage, as the Ukrainian forces would be split between the two river lines, while the Russians can focus on one side of it as they have the initiative while being on the offensive. The Russians are also expanding zone of control in the western flank of Canal. This is to prevent the Ukrainians from counterattacking and hitting the supply lines of the Russian forces by pushing the direction of Canal across the border, strengthening the offensive operations of the Russian forces towards Myropilya. It will also allow the Russians to push into Zaporizhzhia, which is also fairly isolated, with the Sel River on the eastern flank and western flank, isolating it from both neighboring towns. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.